Okay, that brings us to the public hearing. Rent Review Ordinance, first reading. And even, Isabel, before you start, I just want to remind you all that there are a lot of people here tonight. We want to listen to everybody. And as we go through this, you're probably going to hear some things you like and some things you don't like, but please be respectful of everyone and allow this to be a full discussion to enable the best possible outcome to emerge.
And Mayor, a reminder that I'm recused from this item, and as this is the last substantial item of the meeting, I shall leave.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, council members, Madam Mayor. Developing a rent review ordinance is identified as a goal within the City Council's strategic plan in support of the objective to promote housing availability. Over the last several months, the City Council has been receiving information and providing direction on the implementation of a non-binding rent review program. The current action before the City Council is to conduct the first reading of the Rent Review Ordinance and to receive an update regarding outcome of the task force meeting to discuss the draft Rent Review Ordinance. On January 8, 2018, the Council directed staff to develop the first draft of the ordinance and review by a 6-member task force consisting of 2 members each from the Social and Economic Justice Commission, Albany Property Rights Advocates, and Diverse Housing Working Group. The task force was to meet up to 2 times. Staff was to collect input and report to Council on areas of consensus, disagreement, and provide a staff recommendation. 2 dates were originally selected for the task force to meet, but due to unforeseen circumstances, the first meeting was canceled, and the task force met on March 20th, 2018 for about 3 hours. The task force reviewed and provided input on all key program elements proposed in the ordinance. A chart summarizing comments received on proposed key elements of the ordinance by each group and staff recommendation is provided as attachment 2 to this report. The task force did express interest in meeting a second time to discuss other elements not included in the current draft. Elements suggested included tenant protections, just causes for evictions, and funding for the rent review program. At this point in time, it is recommended that the Council move forward with the rent review ordinance given that the major key elements have been discussed by the task force. In addition, the draft ordinance incorporates and includes reference to existing state law regarding retaliatory evictions. Should it be determined that additional issues must be resolved regarding just cause eviction and or tenant protection during the implementation phase of the program, the Council may direct the Social and Economic Justice Commission or formulate another short-term task force to conduct further analysis regarding this matter and provide recommendation to Council. Staff researched local rent review programs to gain an understanding of opportunities to customize a rent review program for Albany, with the goal to provide landlords and tenants a forum to discuss and resolve disputed rent increases. Several key elements were considered in the writing of the rent review ordinance, and staff is recommending that the Council follow current trends in rent review programs. The draft ordinance aims to include any items that the task force found to be agreeable among the 3 entities, as well as staff analysis to identify suitable trends within existing rent review ordinance, and combined with customization to ensure appropriateness for Albany. A comparison chart detailing key elements of rent review programs for the cities of Union City, San Leandro, and Fremont is included as attachment 3 to the staff report. As for the financial impact, funding for the implementation of the program will be incorporated into the draft fiscal year 2018-19 operation budget. Expenses include contracting services for administration of the rent review program, conciliation and mediation services, estimated at $50,000, and staff costs to implement the program and act as liaison between residents and contractors at about $45,000. The draft ordinance includes discussion regarding cost reimbursement for the program. Based on current count, there are 2,004 rental units within the City of Albany. Staff is proposing a cost of $15 per unit be applied to help cover overall costs associated with the rent review program. It should be noted that this cost is estimated to cover approximately 1/3 of overall program costs and has been set at this level to avoid obligating any one group with the responsibility for funding the entire program. The fee per unit amount will also be included in the city's master fee schedule, which is adopted annually by the council. And this will also allow another opportunity for on an ongoing basis for any amendments that may need it to be done. As for next step, pending direction from the council, staff will prepare a rent review ordinance for a second reading and outline steps for the development and implementation of a rent review program. Based on staff discussions with other jurisdictions that have implemented rent review programs, it is anticipated that implementation will require approximately 5 months.
Thank you. Are there questions from council? Questions?
Okay, I'll start off with a question. So, would this ordinance cover UC Village and the housing in UC Village?
No, it doesn't cover UC Village.
Okay, and is that by state law that we could not do that, or it was never intended to do that?
Well, it was never intended to do that, but there's because the landowners is UC Berkeley, the rentals are being paid to UC Berkeley, so it's not independent landowners who own each of the units.
Okay.
So UC Berkeley being the landlord.
Okay. That was my one small question. I have other things to say, but I'll wait to hear what everyone has to say.
Okay.
Michael, do you have questions? Okay, I do. So sort of to piggyback on what Pete said, do we need to specifically exclude UC Village in the ordinance? Would that make it more clear in that one section?
I think that would be a good idea to make the council's intent clear.
Okay. I think it goes under 5-25.2K is where I think it should go.
Definition.
As far as in the next section, the trigger of what constitutes a rent review, I'm wondering if we should consider, trying to make this a question, or why it was not considered to use either the CPI or the ECI, which is the Employment Cost Index. Why those weren't considered?
Well, the rent review program is meant to be the goal of the program is to provide a forum for landlords and tenants to come together and talk about disputed rent increases. And a percentage is always a little higher because a CPI rate is more of it basically monitors rent increases, right? It really, because it's so low as compared to a 7% or 10% rent increase. So the cost of CPI would require, if CPI was used, then it would be at 2.2, 2.9%, and it would really, at this point, it would really not provide, how should I say this?
Also, if you look at the trigger for the other cities that we're comparing to that have rent review programs, not rent control, the trigger ranges from 7 to 10%. So we tried to find ourselves in the middle of that for comparability.
Could you then describe for all of us the difference between conciliation and mediation?
Yes, conciliation is usually more a phone call between the two parties and trying to resolve the situation amicably and simply. If conciliation doesn't work out, then mediation is done by a professional mediator and is in person.
And does somebody monitor the conciliation? Is that done by an outside person?
Yes, it's also, yes, it would also be done by an outside.
And then my last question is, in section 525.4D, number 3, failure to participate in the conciliation, should we add the without good cause for both tenant and the landlord? It seems like anytime that we talk about participation, it should have in there without good cause.
Sure, we could add without good cause.
4D, 3.
Can you give the line number that you're referring to?
Oh, no, I can't do that. I can in a minute, wait a minute,
Okay.
sorry. Where am I here, 4D3? Actually, I think it starts on 6 and goes to 10, and you're just adding a phrase. Nicole, I can email it to you also. And I guess my last question, if the landlord fails to participate, when can they do another attempt at a rent increase? Whenever they want?
Yes, there's no delay.
Okay. All right. Well, I have lots of thoughts, but we'll let those go for now. Could I see a show of hands of how many would like to speak? Good. Good. I am going to limit it to 2 minutes tonight. There's a lot of you here. Please try not to repeat previous speakers. You can agree, make some new points. And I also want to remind you, again, of the rules of decorum. Be respectful of each speaker. You need to address the council and not the audience. And remember that we don't do applauding. We don't do any negative comments or noise. We want everybody to feel like they're really welcome and that we want you to feel comfortable speaking, no matter what your perspective is. Don't want anybody to be intimidated by audience comments or reactions. If you haven't yet turned in your speaker card, please be sure at some point that you do that. And Ann, can you call the first 3? And we'll call you up in groups of 3, and then if you could line up over there, we can move through this fairly quickly.
Margie Marks, Leah Burrow, and Kirk Schumacher.
I have several issues with the ordinance as it is written. The 7% trigger is way too high. I have a chart that she's passing around that shows the effect of rent increases over a 5-year period. With a 7% increase each year, the rent will go up 40% over 5 years. According to the Albany Housing Element, over 55% of Albany renters are already paying it more than the HUD recommended amount of their income on housing. If you look at the chart, the trigger amounts, that's the other chart, of other cities, the 7% is at the high end. It would mean it may work in cities like San Leandro, where the median rent is lower than in Albany, in fact, by about $900 a month. But for Albany renters, many are already at the limit, and it will limit their ability to stay here. The second issue is the pass-throughs. Excluding the pass-throughs just makes the ordinance more confusing. First, it doesn't define them, so it confuses landlords and tenants. Second, if you look at the ordinance, it says that parking and storage are pass-throughs. These are 2 items, unlike utilities, the landlord has complete control over, and there's no reason they shouldn't be included in the rent. There is a lifeline, in addition to what Peggy mentioned, in the ordinance for landlords that is not included. We want it extended to the tenants. In the ordinance under section 5-2, 5-4, rent review deconciliation, it says failure of the landlord to respond with the director, it gives extenuating circumstances. We want the tenants extended those same extenuating circumstances if they are unable to meet the 15-day calendar limit of the tenant's notice of rent increase. I applaud the housing providers. They've done a great job of organizing and taking care of themselves. I would ask you, City Council members, to protect and take care of the 51% of Albany residents who are tenants. Thank you.
Margie, before you go.
Yes.
Could you repeat again where you, I don't know where you are.
It's the protection for the landlord is in section 5-25-4, rent review deconciliation.
Can you give us the line?
I'd have to look. I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, that's right. Well,
I started quoting failure of the landlord to respond to the director within 15 calendar days, absent a finding of good cause by the director, and then it goes on to say good cause shall include. So I think the same protection should be limited to the tenant if they can't respond within the 15 days.
Line 20.
okay, great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Leah Burrell. I won't repeat what Margie had to say. That's a lot of what I wanted to say, but I wanted to reiterate that I think the trigger is too high. It is not sustainable. You can't every year keep continuing to raise the rent over and over and over again. places that people live as tenants, these are our homes. These where we create memories. We have family, we have nurturing, we go home and cook our meals and be a part of this community. Annual rent increases frustrates that process. It creates a lot of stress for renters. They have to go out and get a second or a third job to support the retirement of landlords. And I think that a balance needs to be struck. Somewhere in there, we need to follow other trends in our communities. Adjacent cities are doing, tying the increases to the CPI, and I really think we need to focus in on that. I don't know the exact figures, but people who earn money are not getting a 7% wage increase every year. I think that CPI is more realistic for people's incomes. Not everybody who lives in Albany has got a lot of money. Putting tenants out because they can't afford the increases disrupts the complexion and the character of Albany. Students, children have to leave schools. Neighborhoods are disrupted because people leave because they can't afford the rent anymore. I really want to council to readdress this about the rent increase trigger. I think we need to back it up a lot to function in the real world of real tenants who support the retirement and the building of a portfolio for the landlords. I think tenants deserve that respect. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next three after Kirk would be Jeremiah, David Hertzer, and Karen Gordon.
Hi, my name is Kirk Schumacher. By way of background, I have math and economic degrees from Stanford. I have a law degree and an MBA from University of California. I've been a California real estate broker, currently inactive. I'm a Florida mortgage broker, currently inactive. I've been a Albany landlord for over 45 years now. I have about 450 tenant years of landlord experience. For those of you who haven't done the math, that's about 5,400 monthly tenant rent decisions that I have made over the last 45 years. The appropriate rental decision that this board would be taking would be to determine, I think, what the fair market value is for a rental. In the 5,400 decisions I have made about whether to raise the rent for this tenant or that tenant or some other tenant, I one time thought maybe I'll raise the rent a little bit over fair market rent because it'll be more of a hassle for them to move than to pay a few extra dollars. Within 30 days, they were out of that unit. I had a vacancy. I had to do maintenance. I had to do painting. Landlords do not want vacancies. Landlords do not want to charge more than the fair market rent because it just doesn't work. The appropriate thing for this rental review board, if you persist in thinking it makes any sense to have, is for them to determine the fair market value. What somebody has in the way of a mortgage is irrelevant because there are some people who've just bought a building, others who may have paid off their mortgage over the years. Tenant hardship. You know, if somebody decides they want to support their West Virginia cousin in their third opioid rehab, that's no reason why they shouldn't pay an appropriate rent. I think that that fair market value should be the only criterion for deciding what the appropriate rent is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeremiah, David Hertzer.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. I'm David Hertzer. I have owned and managed two small apartment buildings in Albany since 1972. This morning I sent you a letter making several points, and I'd like to just briefly highlight a few of those points. Number one, the staff report says there are 2,004 rental units in Albany. I'm not sure how staff got that, but I think staff should explain to council how they came by that. The census material in the Albany housing element indicates that in 2010, there were 3,811 rental households in Albany. Deducting the 974 units from UC Village, you come up with 2,837 units subject to the ordinance, which is about 42% higher than the staff figure. The 2004 figure should not be used to calculate costs, and staff should go back and take another look at that. The second point was one of the questions that the mayor asked, and that was the ordinance as it presently is written includes all the rental units in UC Village, which is about 974 units. Unfortunately, I was sitting in the back. I did not hear council's response. But I would think that the ordinance should be as clear as possible, and as clear as possible, it should expressly say does not include UC Village rental units. Third, market rent should be a factor in the mediator's decision as to what is a fair rent. And this factor is included in the Fremont Rent Ordinance, which you have a copy in your materials, and it was not in the Union City Ordinance. I suggest that you look at the materials and include that factor in the evaluation by the mediator. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
After Karen would be Kathy Deal, Benny Fong, and Moshi.
Hi, my name's Karen Gordon. I've lived in Albany for about 12 years, in the Bay Area since 1976. And our rent had gone up $50 a month for the first few years. Then it bumped up to $150 a month. Then it went to $235 a month more, and then $268 a month more. So in the last 2 years, our rent has increased almost 21%. We made the decision to stay where we are because we really like Albany and our neighbors in the apartment building. But we're concerned when our next lease comes up that we might have to leave, and I don't want to leave. I would also reiterate that 7 to 10% is way too high. If you want to maintain the people that are currently living here, I would suggest 4% or 5% at the most. And I guess that's all I have to say. That we have had families have to leave our apartment complex several times because the rent got too high. And, you know, I understand that there was some concern that there would be rent control, and that's why we were bumped up so high the last 2 years to kind of get some kind of a baseline for if there was rent control. But, you know, we've dealt with our landlords about that. But again, another 7 to 10% increase is much more than we would ever be able to make at our jobs. So $503 over 2 years is quite a bump per month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I read over the draft Rent Review Ordinance, and I found that the goals are very admirable to secure stable housing for its residents. I think that's what this is all about. Here are some of the concerns that I have, and other people as well share with me, about the draft ordinance. This 7%, as people have mentioned, is too high. For a 2-bedroom apartment, the median rent is expected to be about $2,800 at this time. For over a 5-year period, that would create a 40% increase, up to $3,925. That's $1,100. The CPI, on the other hand, is apparently about 2.2% now. It would result in an 11% increase from $2,800 to about $3,100. That's approximately paying another $100 per year, which is already relatively high, but much more reasonable. Something that we're concerned about is that just cause eviction hasn't been addressed at the workshop or the task force. Although we have brought that issue up consistently at our meetings. Without just cause eviction, the rent review process can be circumvented. The rent can be raised by the landlord so that the tenants will be moved out tenants can be moved out. And I'm also concerned about the 150 days. That's far too long of a period. None of the cities listed took 150 days to get their ordinance in place.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, good evening. This is first time I speak on on any meeting.
Well, welcome.
I moved to Albany about 15 years ago. Both of my kids grow up here, and I like this place out of Palo Alto, Sunnyvale, all those places, because here people is friendly. You go down the street, you meet people, they smile. I love my block in Talbot. Everyone's friendly. We have all kind of people, and we all get along. But I feel once you put in the rent control, then you pretty much forcing people to subsidize one group against another. You are starting a fight, a divisive in Albany. And that's not what I want to see. Plus that, plus once you start that, the person who move in to, for example, could be a lawyer, move into to a room, and he can stay there for 20 years, and he paying, what, $1,000, $1,500 now? And I have no idea how people said 2-bedroom right now is $2,800. Go to Craigslist, it's around $2,000. $2,000, $2,200. And so those numbers, I don't know where they're getting from, but I think the fair one is to go to Craigslist. That's where everyone look for housing. I mean, if you look for like a, online website, that's not right. So I feel that I had to speak out this time because I truly love this city. I'm very proud of staying in the city, and I don't want we have a big fight here. And most of the people live in this city, we are not rich. We might have one home to rent it out or something, but by all means that we can retire on that. And people say they subsidize for us the retirement. Come on, if you can retire, you don't live in Albany. You live in Sunnyvale. So that's what I want to say. I mean, I truly love this city, and I don't want to see it get destroyed, like Berkeley or San Francisco.
Thank you.
After Moshe is Brian Martin, Jane Luncheon, and Peter Pan. Yes.
My name is Moshe. I live in Albany for about 35 years in my house. I would like to say that I don't have any affiliation with any landlord in town. Actually, I don't know many people in town here. I don't own any units in town other than my own house. I have a great sympathy for the elderly. That what I heard here about that they deal with the difficulties of rent control. But this is one side of the formula. The other, I heard that landlords are supposed to pay $50 per unit for this, and I ask myself, why landlord has to pay for that? This is a public issue. Why the burden is on the landlord themselves? Why it's not the entire people in town carry the burden? And besides, I would like to talk. I read tens of articles about within about the last 4 or 5 months about the rent control online, and I found out that about Berkeley. I take Berkeley as an example. In the first 10 years of the rent control in Berkeley, the city lost 1,200 houses. 40% of the apartment units of 9,600, I think, or 9,300, 40% of that. And then a city the size of Berkeley with 100,000 population has to have a new unit built at $250 to $350 a year in order to keep pace with the growth. Let's average it on to 300. In 24 years, the city has built 8 units. No one wants to build in the city that has rent control. You add all these figures, the actual loss and those that were potentially lost, it's 12,000 units. 12,000 units with 3% per unit. You have 36,000 people that could live in the city, and they don't.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm Jane Lundeen. I'm an owner of 3 small buildings in Albany starting 30 years ago. And I came to congratulate the council on considering a middle way here, not trying to force landlords to live on a 2.2% annual raise, and not just letting it go, providing some support for tenants too. Of course, 7% every year would drive people out of their units. But that, as I understand it, is a threshold, and you're trying to put conciliation or mediation in for the serious cases. It seems like a good place to start. And I also want to follow up on the person who spoke a couple before me. There really is a market here. You read about these astronomical rents, and I said to my manager, oh, well, we ought to try $2,000 for this newly renovated 1-bedroom we have. Well, we didn't get a single call, and we rented it. We got applications and rented it at $1,750. It's a nice unit. It's not renting for $2,000 or $3,000, in spite of what the newspapers say.
Thank you.
After Peter would be Julie Winkleson, Jim Beller, and, Brian Beal.
Hi, my name is Brian Martin. I'm a 13-year resident and a small landlord, own a duplex. And I wanted to thank the council for getting input from different stakeholders on this. I do think an ordinance like this is one part to address a need in the community. I had a few suggestions and concerns. One is it says contents of notice, all notices shall be in writing, shall be mailed or delivered in person. And I'm wondering if email can be added to that. We've always emailed our tenants just about everything. And then that's 5-25.3 Part B. The language for what the notice should say at the very end of that, it says under Civil Code section blah, it is illegal for a landlord to retaliate against a tenant for lawfully and peaceably exercising his or her legal rights. And it ends with a period. I think it would be nice to add including the right to rent review to specify that that particular thing is protected. I live near the Orientation Center for the Blind, and so when people were talking about excluding UC Village, I don't know how the Orientation Center deals with its people there, if they're tenants. If they are, they probably need to be excluded too. The fee says the landlord pays. I know in some cities it's split with the landlord and the tenant, and I would recommend that to run the program so that it hits everybody if the rates go up. There's also a typo in that section. It says residential shall pay, which doesn't make sense.
Excuse me, can you tell us where you are? I'm sorry.
It's under miscellaneous 5-25.5. 5-25.5 miscellaneous part B2. That's the place where it talks about a fee to run the program, or at least supports part of the program.
And where's the typo?
Typo says landlord of each residential shall pay a fee.
Okay.
It's missing a word or something. Residential unit.
Thank you.
Property. And then would just like to make sure this isn't the only way that the city is helping out with housing, and would like to hear other ways the city is helping encourage more development, either
Okay, Brian,
cottages or other.
you've gone
types.
over. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Peter Pan. I'm a real estate broker for about 25 years. Today I'm going to talk about cost. The cost of rent control, both hard costs and soft costs. And I would suggest that soft costs even more than hard costs. Now, the city staff put in the report that their estimate cost for doing this rent review ordinance is about $90,000. Berkeley has a budget of $5.5 million for their rent control. Admitted, Albany has 2,000 units. Berkeley has 20,000 units. So 10 times $9,000 is $90,000. So are you suggesting that Berkeley board skimping about 80% of their rent fee? The cost is so underestimated to the point that I think is misleading. Let me read about some of the costs from Berkeley. They have $270 for rent stabilization fee. They have $26 for rental housing safety programs. They have $77 for business license per rental property. They have $25 for registration fee, and they have $87.50 for fire prevention. So they add up a total to almost $500 per unit. Now, admittedly, we have business license fee and all this stuff, but still, we have this cost is add up to almost 1.5% of the average rent. So are you telling me that by adding about 1.5% to the cost, that you are going to make rent more affordable to the tenants? Now, this is only the hard cost.
Okay, your time really is up, so one more sentence.
Oh, I'm sorry. The soft cost is bigger than the hard cost, but I don't have time. I'll come back next time about the soft cost.
We'll be waiting. Okay, next, Julie.
I'm speaking in opposition to the 7% trigger and the unmonitored pass-throughs. I encourage you to set the trigger at CPI or even a percentage of the CPI, as other cities have done. I know you found cities that have higher percentages, but there are cities with lower ones, and I'm not really clear on why you didn't quote those on your chart. I also want to point out that tonight on your agenda, you have this quote, this comment about, we would like to take this opportunity to reaffirm that we welcome and value all of our diverse community members, regardless of where they are from, who they love, how they worship, how they look, their abilities, or how they vote. Missing from this list of kinds of diversity is socioeconomic status, which is at the heart of the discussion of rent review. The fact this wasn't taken into account makes me wonder what kind of diversity you do support. We need to decide what kind of community we want. Are we looking for those who can afford the increasingly high costs of housing in this area? Is that our goal, to become homogenous when it comes to socioeconomic status? I assume you've seen the statistics on how more people are renting, paying more than 30% of their income on rent, unable to buy homes. How can we justify contributing to this story? How can you price out some of our community members? Who are we losing? Please consider making the trigger the CPI or even a percentage of the CPI, as other cities do. Consider helping Albany to be an inclusive community, not an exclusive one. And I've given out a sheet that shows what happens if it's 7%, because it has to be over 7%, as it says in yours, to trigger the rent review. So in 10 years, it doubles the rent with 7%. If you use the CPI, it's about, I don't know what percentage it is, but it's a lot less. So I really encourage you to think about who you're supporting here and who you're not supporting. Thank you.
Thank you.
After Jim Beller, there's a gentleman with D initial, Menaggio, Brian Beal, and Francesco Papalia.
Good evening. you folks know me, I do the dog shower program, and I'm very concerned about homeless people in Albany, and I really appreciate that we're working towards the rent review ordinance. I think that could prevent people from getting into a unsustainable rent. Of course, I share Margie's objections to the trigger amount being as high as it is. And okay. Also, the disparity in power between the tenants and the landlords is discouraging to me. The landlords had a tax-free way to pay for and organize their political and legal opposition to any limits on their ability to raise rents. And now the realtors, I understand, are threatening legal action, while the tenants are entirely unorganized. And I think that the current draft reflects this disparity, that the people from APRA walked into the task force meeting, for instance, knowing everybody by name, and the tenants don't have an equal voice because they don't have the equal familiarity, and they don't have the equal capital, and they don't have the equal level of organization. But thank you.
Thank you.
Minagio?
Dave Minagio.
Sorry.
Is that me?
Your name, yes.
That's me.
Okay.
Okay, this is my first time here at the Albany City Council. I've been a landlord in this city since 1991, and I was asked to come up here and state the position of my perception of being a landlord. It's obvious to me that a lot of folks here that are tenants are paying a lot of money for rent, and me being a landlord, I have to charge that to recover my cost and to meet the mandates of the federal government to charge a certain amount of rent in this city for the units that I have, to be able to write off my expenses for those units. I didn't write anything down. I didn't know what to expect. So all I can tell you is that if you don't make it profitable for the landlords, you're going to reduce that incentive to endure what we have to endure to maintain those properties to a habitable level. When that comes, I could see some landlords selling their property and rents will automatically escalate just because of the principle of supply and demand. I spent several $1,000s on one unit this year. I spent several thousand on another unit last year. The taxes have gone up. The property taxes have gone up. The cost of the business license that I buy from the city of Albany, that has gone up. And, you know, the cost for services from plumbers, carpenters, and stuff like that, all these things have gone up. And the bottom line, the absolute minimum amount that I must charge in order to be able to write off those expenses is what's dictated in my tax laws.
Thank you.
I'm all done. Say to me.
Hi, I'm Brian Beal. I don't want to get caught too much in the weeds with this, but what I wanted to say, I think it's real important for landlords and tenants to understand the other person's viewpoint, or the other, I would say, party's viewpoint, because right now both are really caught in a difficult position. We talked about the trigger. Some people said 7% was too low. People I've talked to have gotten rent increases of over 10% and have gotten them persistently. I've seen people leaving my block. So my concern on the one hand is seeing the character of our community, that there's no stability for our families, because your kids are having to leave town, go to another city within a year, I don't think that's good for your kids. But on the other hand, a landlord buying a new building, in order to be able to make it work, he's going to have to raise the rent. But keep in mind, California state law requires that cities can't pass a law that that denies the landlord a reasonable return on his investment. So, so that said, I think what's needed here is to go along these lines of getting people talking to each other. But I think what we need to be real clear about is this rent control or not? And I think one of the things throughout this discussion is drifted into rent control. So if we're saying it's not rent control, then it cannot limit the amount that people are charging. So I'm a little bit worried about some of the fees, or that it's not effective if, that said, but again, I wanted to thank everyone for their work. And again, I think it's important for people to see each other's viewpoint and have a forum for tenants and landlords to talk about things. Thank you.
Thank you.
After Francesco will be Elaine Stelton, Peter Campbell, and Pang Cao.
Good evening, Council. Let's make it clear that the issue of using the CPI or a percentage of the CPI is a terrible idea, and it's a terrible idea because that's the number that all of the cities that use rent control use. That's why we don't want it. So if you stand up here and say we should use the CPI, that means rent control. That's what the other cities call rent control. The present draft of the Rent Review Ordinance appears to be in large part a word-for-word copy of the Union City Ordinance. Union City, it has 4 times the population, is around 10 times our size. And Albany is not Union City. In the draft ordinance, it says findings. The City Council makes the following findings in support of approving this ordinance. The city has a substantial governmental interest in regulating the relations between the residential landlords and the tenants in order to increase certainty, stability, fairness, etc. This is an exact copy of the Union City Ordinance. My Albany does not consider a substantial government interest in regulating relations, nor do most of the mostly mom and pop owners here. If anything, this ordinance treats all housing providers the same, and they're not. They're all individuals, and they're showing it tonight. And you're treating them all the same with the same brush. And I have seen Mayor McQuaid take great pains to carefully word the document about what kind of Albany she thinks that we strive to be. And this draft does not represent the kind of city we aspire to or that we are. I don't think we should reuse a unproven and untested program of Union City. Thank you.
Thank you.
Elaine Stelton.
I am a first-time property owner and a novice property manager of a 6-unit building. I can start again. I am a first-time property owner and a novice property manager of a 6-unit building. I had to let go of my property management company that had managed my mother's building during the last 18 years of her life because I could not afford to keep them. I have done a lot of on-the-job training, and thankfully, I have received a lot of help and guidance from my fellow APRA members. I am what you call a mom and pop landlord, except that I am going through a divorce. And I am the sole support for my teenage daughter, so I just call myself a mom and not a mom and pop. What I've learned in the short amount of time that I've been doing this is that this is already a highly regulated business, and that most of the landlords in Albany are mom and pop landlords, many of whom are elderly and are on fixed incomes. My concern is that the additional regulation, if implemented, would be too cumbersome and cause some of our best and kindest housing providers to go out of business. I spoke to a 92-year-old gentleman asking him, I didn't know he was 92 when I asked him to come to this meeting. He said he couldn't. He said, I'll just sell my building. As I mentioned, this is already a highly regulated business, so much so that I don't feel comfortable leasing my own units when they become available. I have 2 units on the market right now. One of them has been on the market for months, and I've not been able to rent it.
Thank you.
Good evening again, Peter Campbell. First of all, I'm in favor of the property owners and the residents talking. I think that's a great idea, and I acknowledge that this proposed ordinance is an attempt to do that, an attempt to facilitate that. I think that's good, but I have a few questions about the ordinance, and I wanted to pose these questions. First, it says any unit in Albany will be subject to this rent review process. I'm curious, it doesn't really say what constitutes a residential unit. Is that a single-family home? Is it a condominium? Is it a B&B rental? Is it somebody renting out a room in their house? It wasn't clear to me exactly what was going to be covered by this ordinance, and I would hope that that could be clarified a little bit. Secondly, has to do with information that will be collected by the city along with the registration. And it doesn't really say what type of information will be collected. I know that the rental units are supposed to be registered with the city. There's a business license that is supposed to be obtained. But this kind of implies that there will be other things that are asked for along with that business license. I don't know what. Profit and loss statement, copies of utility bills, maintenance costs, rent history, tax returns. The way it's written, I think, invites overreach on what can be requested. As far as fees are concerned, the fees aren't really stated except in the staff report. And apparently the tenants will not have to pay anything. I think the tenant should have skin in the game. The owner will pay a fee. The tenant is not proposed to pay a fee. The tenants argue that the owner is able to write the fees off as a business expense. Maybe the tenants should consider their share as part of the cost of housing. And finally, what is a reasonable rate of return? What is the basis for rate of return? How is it calculated? I don't know, and neither does the ordinance. 7% trigger is a trigger, but it's not guaranteeing automatic 7% rent increase every year. If you do that, pretty soon you're going to be pricing yourself out of the market. Thank you.
After Peng is Hannah, Janet Lynn, and Riza Seraph. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name.
Good evening, council members. I'm a small property owner in Albany. I own a small apartment building here. I have a lot of concerns about this rent review program for following reasons. Number one, I think this rent review program will make the small landlords to have less incentive to rent out their property because of the work involved with the rent review and the mediation on this rent increase. So this will reduce supply, and that will be a big problem for the housing shortage in the area, because I think the increasing supply is the only solution to really tackle the housing shortage in Albany. And this program will do the opposite, will reduce supply and not increase supply. Second thing is, I think the rent review program will increase the cost of doing business in Albany. Rental is basically a business, and this increase in business costs will eventually increase rental cost. And because of the time to do all the paperwork, to attend mediation and conciliation, all this will increase the service cost. Number three is I'm opposed to this fee completely paid by landlord. I think it should be split between the landlord and tenant. I think that's it's an unfair burden on landlord to pay all the fees. It should be shared by both parties. And the next point I want to make is that I have several two-bedroom apartments, and none of them rented at more than $2,200. So I heard some number like $2,800. I think that's not realistic. $2,100 is more like a market rate for the two-bedroom apartment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Council and neighbors. My name is Hannah. Thank you so much for the opportunity this evening. My family and we've been in Albany for about 7 years or so. Prior to that, I was born and raised in the Bay Area, and I grew up in Alameda. And upon moving to Albany, I felt like Albany is very Alameda-esque in that there's a rich and beautiful diversity, as mentioned before, and great schools, great neighborhoods, and definitely a place where it is safe and lovely to live and raise a family. With that, my family and we've been renters since the beginning of moving here, and I have some concerns and questions. I know I can't cover all of it now, but I guess it may be specific to our experience, my family's, and some of my neighbors in our building that I've spoken with. We have experienced rent increase annually, and my question is what constitutes fair market value and the percentage of increase with or without significant updates? In our experience, we've had trouble even receiving the bare minimum maintenance for several years. We've just taken our landlord's word at what he will or will not fix. And recently, my neighbors and we have been doing the study. We've been studying up on the California code handbook, and we're going to be studying notes from tonight too. But there has not been maintenance done on our unit, but our rent is increasing, and it's not in livable condition from what we have read so far. So I would like to know if the city is able to monitor that, or if we have to initiate the monitoring to have our units and our buildings checked regularly. Thank you.
Thank you.
After Risa is Ian Bennett, Lisa Larkin.
Hi, my name is Lisa Larkins. I have a friend who lives at 535 Pierce Street, and I'm here on her behalf tonight. I've known her for a really long time, and I'm a landlord as well, so I know pretty much the ins and outs of having income property. I know that a lot of tenants aren't maybe not able to understand what it entails being a landlord. I will summarize this as her mom owns a condo on Pierce Street, and I know that insurance goes up, taxes go up, association fees go up. But however, her mom has just raised the rent on her, not by 7%, not by 10%, but she's developmentally disabled, not on Section 8 housing, and she's in a very particular situation where her mom basically charges her $350 a month rent. She recently got a rent increase. Her mom now wants her to pay $2,350 a month rent. I didn't do the math on that, but I think that is totally outrageous. I think my friend, the reason why we're here tonight is because my friend just tried to get in touch with the mayor and 2 other people on the council, and my friend needs some help, legal help. She can't pay for it. She's developmentally disabled. Her mom's trampling over all her rights, and I know this, and I'm trying to help her. So I would appreciate anyone on the council being able to reach out to her and give her some help. This is all I can say on this, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And, excuse me? If you look on our website, find my page and email me.
I don't have email, we don't have email.
Okay. We'll figure something out.
Thank you.
Only just to talk.
Yeah, I'm Janet Lynn. Rent control is a disaster in Berkeley, and I don't know why we're going down that road. We all know that rent control causes depreciation in property values. And we also believe in freedom to make a living, freedom to own property, and freedom to rent it at market value. And market value is whatever it will take to rent the place. Someone said they tried to rent it at $3,000, no response, and they got it at, no, $2,000, and then they got it at $1,750. So that's market value. The other thing is, if you do need to do rent control, at least exempt individual owners who own 1 or 2 units, or limit it at 4 or 6. Limited to apartment buildings and projects, like UC Village and other big projects. Okay, it will change the character of Albany. This is supposed to be a small community, not like Berkeley, not like Union City, where you copied the rent control ordinance from. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Reza Sarafinejad. I wanted to thank all of you for your time and for being here, what seems to be a very contentious debate. But I also want to say that we really all are on the same side here. Rent review, as we're calling it, rent review, the reason why so many property owners take exception to the idea of even implementing rent review is because it is a slippery slope, and it would not be very difficult at all to go from rent review to rent control. The statement in particular in the Rent Review Ordinance says the city has a substantial government interest in regulating the relations between residential landlords and tenants in order to increase certainty, stability, and fairness within the residential rental market. Now, that sounds good on the surface, but the whole idea of the government stepping in to regulate relationships that families have fostered through the years. My parents own a fourplex here in Albany, and that's their retirement income. That's everything that they have worked for their entire lives. So I think it's important to just kind of point out that the reason why people are kind of on the fence when you talk about rent reviews makes them very nervous that we are just one small step away from implementing rent control. So I really wanted to get around to the idea of what problems will be addressed with the Rent Review Ordinance. Has enough work been done to evaluate the effectiveness of similar rent review programs in other cities? And where is the crisis in particular in Albany? In fact, if you, and I invite all of you to do this, to type into Google, median rent Albany, California, into Google. The very first website that results is from Rent Jungle, and a direct quote says, Albany average rent. As of February 2018, average rent for an apartment in Albany, California is $2,012, which is an 8.45% decrease from last year when the average rent was $2,182. Albany rent trends. Average apartment rent over the previous 6 months in Albany has decreased by $289, minus 12.6%. So what problems will rent review solve? Does it increase affordable housing? No. If you look at cities like Berkeley and Albany that have very strict rent control, homelessness is exploding and skyrocketing. So I think
you need to wrap
something
up.
else needs to be done. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ian Bennett?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the City Council. My name is Ian Bennett. I am one of the members of the Board of Directors of the Albany Property Rights Advocates. And as many of you know, I'm also a real estate and landlord tenant attorney. I'm also a tenant. And I do not support rent control or just cause for one very simple reason, and that is because it destroys communities. There is absolutely no empirical support that any form of rent control, including just cause, works. When we started this discussion about a year and a half ago, one of the main selling points for our organization to get on board and consider lending its support and participation to the formation of a program was the finding of information. It was to enable the City Council to determine what the actual issues were, what the actual numbers were, what the actual needs were. While we have done an excellent job in furthering that discussion, I firmly believe that it is premature for the council to take any action or make any decisions tonight without additional inquiry into important issues, such as the application of certain binding elements of the program, such as denial of rent increases for failure to participate. As against Costa-Hawkins, I firmly believe that is something that the city attorney needs to review and report to the council upon. I also believe that there are a number of ambiguous terms in the proposed ordinance, and even though Isabel has done an excellent job with an initial draft, I believe that the council needs to direct a task force to undertake targeted and strict discussion over additional points to report back to the council for further consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yvonne Tam, Anthony Wong, and Shane White.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Tom, and I have been in 3 cities that have rent control. New York City, since World War II, it's still in place. Berkeley, where we almost lost our land and property because we were owners, just as it started, rent control. And I had to feed that property half my salary every month. And number 3, I have property here, and I decided I'm going to be renovating one of my houses. I would leave it empty, even though I really dearly love to rent to people because housing is so desperately needed. I was afraid I would then get stuck with not being able to get someone out when I was going to do the construction. I believe supply is the answer, and if you would change the rule that requires people to have 2 parking spots per unit, I have an opportunity to make 2 duplex into a triplex, but I would never do it under this circumstance because I have lived through Berkeley and I continue to suffer through Berkeley. And I would rather have a good relationship with my tenants where we have Thanksgiving dinners together, we go to weddings together, we suffer for funerals. I take them to the emergency room when they need help. I get them groceries. That is a much better relationship to have.
Thank you.
Good evening, Council. I'm a small property owner in Albany, too. I'm pretty sure it's going to take long years to become a landlord. I cannot do the math here, but look, property tax going up, labor going up, material going up. Now you're saying put a brake on rent control. I'm totally against that. You destroy the market economy here. It doesn't work if you put a brake on one thing and everything else is going up. How does this balance all this? I don't understand. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Council, sorry I have a little cold. So, I'm a mom and pop owner of a small unit in Albany, and I don't want to go into the personal experience because everyone has their own personal experience. But I can tell you, the cost of business has been going up. I don't know if anyone has tried to hire an electrician or plumber over the past several years, I can tell you the increase in that price is more than the CPI has multiple times. But the fundamental point I want to make is that regulation doesn't work. If you look at a good review by a nice lady named Blair Jenkins last few years, she actually made a very good point that even though economists never agree on anything, the one thing they agree on is rent control doesn't work. She reviewed every form of rent control over the recent decades, and none of them works, and they have a detrimental effect on housing stock, on housing improvement, on rent rate. And you don't have to look very far, including San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland. You'll find those are the cities with the highest rent, and it doesn't help in the long term. And what you're really pitching against with regulation is pitching the current renters against future renters. The current renters get to enjoy a low rent at the cost of future renters because nobody can get into the market. So one person will be paying $1,000, their next door neighbor paying $2,800. That's basically to compensate for the owner for the tenant that's moved in earlier. So what I'm trying to say is that, particularly if you want to regulate and has a trigger set of CPI, it doesn't work for the landlord because the cost of business is way higher than that. It doesn't work for the long-term stability of the rental market. It doesn't work for neighbor relationships between the old tenants and new tenants. And fundamentally, if it doesn't work, then why are we introducing this? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm a little sad because my mom is 96 and she's very ill, so I have to go pretty soon. What I want to say is I don't think Berkeley and San Francisco rent control, rent review is working. It's not working. I know a lot of stories, tenants suing the landlord has to do something back. I heard a lot of stories about this, real stories. So I am thinking, is there another way to solve this housing problem in Albany? Can we build more houses? Can we build more apartment? Sell it, rent it out at reasonable price? There must be other ways to solve this problem. I don't think we should, we don't have to follow San Francisco, Berkeley, those rent review, rent control. There must be other ways. And I have a duplex in Albany. My daughter lives in one unit with a roommate, and the other unit is for another couple with two children. They have been there for 10 years, and we get along very, very well. But with rent review, if it's going to be effective, it scares me because the rent I charge them is way, way below market price. And I also heard, I noticed some of my people that I know who has a little property, they are talking about there's going to be rent review, rent control, and their rent is below market price, and they have to raise the rent dramatically to meet the market price. There's a fear among landlords, and we don't want a city with fears and hostility between landlord and tenants. We want a happy Albany. Oh, I'm sorry. I lived in Albany some years ago. It was very, very nice. Peaceful, happy, friendly. We walk on the street, hi to everyone. With rent review or rent control, it's going to be different. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening, Honorable City Council members, Honorable Mayor. My name is Kieran Shinoy. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Oakland-Berkeley Association of Realtors. I come here tonight to ask one simple question. We had sent some correspondence to City Council before the weekend, and just wanted to ask the Council to broach the question of whether or not single-family homes or and condominium units were going to be included in this ordinance moving forward. Our stance is clearly detailed in the correspondence that we sent you, and we stay strong on that stance for the sole reason that there is a conflict with Costa-Hawkins, and that single-family homes and condominium units should be exempted because Costa-Hawkins is completely trying to, That's a complete conflict with Costa-Hawkins. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak?
Hey, my name's Sam Hoffman. I own a duplex. I see the value in promoting a rent review board. I am of the opinion that in many, many cases, fostering communication between landlords and tenants is the best first step, and I think this draft should focus on that. Then in later drafts, at a later date, when more data is available and has been reviewed on the success of that or failure, considering limits and imposing limits would be prudent at that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michelle?
Good evening. Thank you for your time and everyone for coming out tonight. I am here on behalf of myself as well as several neighbors of mine who are not able to be here, who are renters in Albany in a multiple unit apartment structure. And my neighbors couldn't be here tonight because one of my upstairs neighbor is 84 and can barely walk up and down the stairs, and she has a hard time getting around. And recently, we had to pay for repairs ourselves on her unit, as well as a lot of us have been taking care of a lot of the maintenance of our apartments lately by ourselves. And this isn't to say it, good landlord, bad landlord. I'm listening to the stories here, but there is a lack of security in our situation, and a lot of my neighbors, and in the 5 years I've lived on that street in Albany, I've seen so many moving vans and trucks in and out, and I've met a lot of people who've had to leave because their rents were increased unfairly. I think some of the numbers we've heard in the past year, like by over 50% within a year. I think we can all agree that that's not sustainable for anyone. If my rent were to increase by that amount, I don't think I could, in the same amount of time, increase my income to sustain that, and that's de facto eviction. I also support just cause for eviction, and I think 7% is more than a fair amount for a trigger for rent review. It's a lot higher than places like Berkeley. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, last call. Does anybody want to come up and speak? Okay, come on up. While he's coming up, is there anybody else? Okay.
Good evening. I'm here to say that I'm against the law that you guys required, and I'll tell you why. Because we are in Albany and all the cities between landlord and tenant. I'm a landlord, by the way. I have a small duplex. My situation with my tenant, perfect. Not much raise. If I have raised a little bit of garbage, water, I'll tell him, you have $30, $40 difference, no problem. But when the landlord, they start hearing about the rent control, that's what scared everybody. It scared the landlord, it scared the tenant, and that's what we are facing today. We didn't have to be here today if we didn't have this problem. Look at the city of San Francisco and all the cities around. They're facing the big problem, and I think we're going to face it again in this small community. We didn't need that. Now, sure, I sympathize with the tenants. Sure, a tenant, he have to have a further replaced, and I am with that. But at the same time, the landlord, he gonna make sure that he's paying his expenses. When I have a house or a unit that being destroyed by I'm not gonna say destroyed, a big damage by a tenant, and I have to spend $12,000, $13,000 to fix it, and I lost 2-3 months of rent, this is $15,000. If I calculate the $15,000 means what, $1,200 per month? Even I raise $100 only, I need more than 10 years to collect this money back to my pocket. Do you think this is fair? I'm not sure if this is fair. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bring it back to council. I think there were a couple of questions I think would be appropriate to answer, if I can find them. So Isabel, could you talk a little bit about the number of units and where that number comes from?
So the number of units comes from the business license fee that the city collects for all rental properties. So currently we have 825 business licenses for rental for buildings being rented, and of those 2,004 units, which includes 2,004 units.
Okay. And what is meant by a unit?
It's an like a single residence, like an apartment or a family home, a condo, any unit that somebody lives in and is rented.
Okay. I don't know if we need to clarify that a little bit or if a unit is adequate. Leave that to you. And then two more things. It was mentioned about, there's a section in here about other information as asked for by the city, I believe in the, for the landlord. And if we could sort of clarify that, I think that's a little too ambiguous.
Would you like that to be included in the ordinance?
Well, at least I'd like to know what you're referring to.
Well, it would be just similar to what is being asked for the business license. So name of landlord, units rented, address, location of the rental unit, just for the purpose of collecting the fee.
So maybe we could take out that phrase that says other information. I'm sorry, I don't exactly know where this is. Let's see, Peter Campbell, I think you're the one that mentioned that. Do you know where that is?
Section 5-25.5.
Okay, never mind, Craig has it. I'm sorry, what?
Section 5-25.5, where there's discussion of property registration and fees. There's a registration form that includes certain specified information. Then there's kind of the catch-all, as well as other information. This is on the second to last page.
Okay. We might want to think about that other information piece. That might be, make people nervous. Again, I guess the other thing, Craig, if you don't mind, could you give us your thoughts about the ordinance in relation to Costa-Hawkins?
Yeah, I sure can. The Realtor's position is partially correct, in my opinion. The Costa-Hawkins law does preempt a local rent control regulation as applied to single-family homes or condominiums or units constructed after February 1st of 1995. My position would be that the ordinance as currently proposed does not constitute rent control. There are provisions that void rent increases if a landlord does not go through a certain process in terms of providing a specified notice, participating in good faith in conciliation and mediation. But the city would not be regulating the amount of any allowable rent increase. So my position would be that the ordinance as presented does not conflict with Costa-Hawkins.
Thank you. Okay, comments from council? Michael, you want to start?
Yeah, I just want to say that while I was, at the beginning of the meeting, I was looking up the Albany census data, and the census does say that there are 8,000 living units in Albany, and half of them are rentals. So that's about 4,000. So if you take them out, you take out University Village. I'm sorry, I don't know why I lost my voice, but it'll come back.
Oh, joy.
That would be about 3,000, but to me, this is precisely why we need to gather this kind of information, and one of the real advantages of this rent review program is so we can get some idea of how many units there are and what the rents are. And I'm sorry if I refer to people by their first names, but we've been doing this for 2 years now. I sort of know everybody in the audience, or at least half. Peter, what's Peter's last name? Goodman?
Campbell.
Peter did have some concerns about the information, but I want to stress that there really is some information we've got to collect just to be able to make rational decisions. And one would be just how much rent is being charged. My impression is, both from what I read in the papers and what I hear from landlords in this town, is rents have stabilized and are dropping a little. So the immediate crisis is over. They're still a little high. I can tell you, a year ago, my son was renting a 500 square foot studio in Emeryville, and the rent was over $2,000. So maybe rents have softened since then, I don't know. So I want to go back and address some specific points. I don't know if Yvonne Tom is still out there, but I know where you live, Yvonne, but we got rid of the parking requirements already. You don't have to worry about that anymore. That was one of the reasons we did the Measure D revision. So if I can't find you, I'll come talk to you about it. Other points, Ian, the attorney for the landlords, did mention the value of finding information. I concur with that. There's many people spoke tonight who are still have the misperception that we are planning on doing rent control, because they say it didn't work in all Berkeley and San Francisco. We agree with that because we decided months and months ago we weren't going to do rent control. That's been off the table for at least a year. The kind of rent review program we do leads to arbitration, and showing up for the mediation, rather. Showing up for the mediation is required, but once it's done and both sides have talked to each other, the landlord is still free to do whatever they want with their rent. We are not attempting to control rent. We're just trying to get people to talk to each other. And that's how this works in Union City and in Fremont and in San Leandro. And I think the track record has been pretty good. So this is not rent control. This is not what happened in San Francisco. This is not what happened in Berkeley. Reza, I'm sorry, just use your first name. Again, Reza just walked out, I think. We're not going to rent control. It's too complicated for a town this size. It really isn't even on the horizon. What we've really struggled to get right here in those almost 2 years we've been thinking about that is we realize and acknowledge that a lot of our mom and pops basically already provide affordable housing. I know landlords, I talked to them about how much they rent their units for. Some of them don't have mortgages anymore. They're good friends with their tenants. And that situation isn't broke, and we don't want to fix it. We want to set, like, for example, the 7% figure, we want to set that level high enough that the mom and pops who get along well with their tenants and are being good landlords fly under the radar screen. We don't want to mess with a good thing. And we have a little bit of asymmetric information here, because when there are bad landlords, and sometimes those are out-of-town companies that are they're management companies, I hear about it. You don't hear about it, but I do, because I get angry emails from people who can't afford to live in Albany anymore. So there really is a problem, and I think we are trying to address that with this rent review. As far as the 7% figure, I used to teach economics. It's a nominal, not a real figure. It's not adjusted for inflation. I could talk to you all night about that. You don't want to hear it. The reality is people tend to budget on nominal terms. They don't try to, like when I do a budget in Quicken or whatever, I don't try to adjust it for inflation month by month. I just go with whatever the current prices are. So I think a 7% nominal figure is reasonable. It was a figure that was agreed upon in the negotiations between the landlord group and our Social and Economic Justice Committee and our Diverse Housing Group. No, it doesn't mean, you know, for example, if you get along with landlords, if you get along with your tenants and you need to raise the rent more than 7% in a year, that is not a mandatory trigger. If you talk to your tenants and they go, yeah, that sounds fair, I understand that deck rotted out and you need a little more money to fix it, it's fine. As long as they don't come and appeal to us, there's nothing mandatory about going through this process. So if you have good relationships with your tenants and you are in good touch with them, you're already 3/4 of the way there to what this rent review process is trying to address. But not all tenants and landlords have that kind of relationship, especially in bigger units or professionally managed units. So we're trying to, walk a tightrope here and not fix things that don't need to be fixed, but we do want to address things that do need to be fixed. And I'll go through the rest of this fast because I'm sure other people have other things to say. Oh, the $15 fee, is that annually or monthly?
Annual.
$15 annual fee. I mean, come on. It's not worth hassling with your... I just think it doesn't really matter who absorbs it. That's not something worth fighting about, $15 a year. Come on. Let's be real. There's some, there's a lot of little things that came up. You got to understand, this is a first reading. This is a draft. We're here tonight to hear people's comments, and then typically, formally, a council does not approve something like this until there's a second reading. So between now, the first reading, and the second reading, we can go back and try to incorporate some comments. I'm not sure how formal a process we'll want to do, but what this town will see upon the second reading will have some of your comments incorporated. So we're not done tonight. I want to stress that. And I'm not sure, maybe Isabel can tell us what the timeline is going to be for when we're going to come. We'll be back for the second reading. But there will be more process. That's all I wanted to say. And that's it.
I'd just like to jump in here for a minute. I'd like to get as many concrete changes that we'd like and get it to staff tonight. So when it comes back, it's coming back as a fairly finalized draft. Does that make sense to you three?
Yeah, the return of the ordinance for second reading will really depend on the substance of the changes suggested.
But let's try to get all the changes in tonight.
And I would just like to finish by saying thank you all for your patience and being polite. This is a much more constructive and better meeting than the ones we were having a year and a half ago.
Your turn.
Okay, I'm up. I have a whole bunch of ideas that were going in my head, and I'll try to organize them in some sense, in some way that makes sense. Once again, as Michael said, we're not supporting rent control. I firmly believe that's not the path we're going down here. We're basically trying to get a handle on what is going on in rent and set up this dialogue between landlords and tenants. Yes, this will probably change the dynamic a bit here and some of the relationships, particularly for the smaller landlords, many of which are very close to their tenants. But, Albany's gone through a lot of changes in the last number of years, both in our demographics and expenses and everything else. Many of them good. I think our city manager sent out something recently about how we're now the second most desirable place in California to live. This was done by niche.com. They had a lot of criteria, but, I think everyone who lives in Albany or spends time in Albany, realizes that. This is a pretty special place. There was something in the beginning of the staff report that says that we're doing this to support housing availability, and I took a little umbrage to that. This isn't going to, I don't think, support availability as much as stability. Availability has to be definitely connected to building more housing. I've been one of the biggest proponents up here from the time I was on Planning and Zoning Commission. We need more housing built in Albany, and that's what will end up stabilizing the market or helping stabilize the market. Other things that could stabilize the market is an economic crash, but hopefully we're not going in that direction. From what I read, in the last year or so, the population in the Bay Area has gone down a bit, and rents have dropped in places like Albany and some other communities. And there's also been a lot of housing that are in construction or online, particularly in places like Berkeley and San Francisco. So both places have rent control, but they're both places where they're doing a lot of housing, and just more and more is coming along. That's a good thing. But these cycles are cyclical. So even though rents may have been going down in the last year, they can start going up again. And the idea that when rents start going up, it really affects the community. It really adds instability to our population, which we as council members do have an interest in. So, that's why this whole thing has been going forward, that we want to know what's going on. One of the things I liked looking at the report that we got was that there were 3 groups working in this task force: the SEJC, the Albany Property Owners Group, and the Diverse Housing Working Group, which is proponents for low-income housing. I think you all should pat yourselves on the back of how many things you were able to agree with, which I think is a good thing. There are some differences here, and we're trying to address those. But for the most part, I think people have a good sense of how something like this could go forward and be shaped. One of my concerns, as this was initially started to be talked about, was whether this would slow up our encouragement of in-laws apartments and extra housing. It's still a concern, but I think if you look at places where they have even more restrictive policies, rent control, it certainly hasn't discouraged housing in those situations, as I said before, in Berkeley or San Francisco. And I don't think we should do anything to discourage in-law apartments, because at this point it's probably our best bet at getting more housing built here and addressing at least some part of the rental market. There was a lot of discussion about whether 7% should be the number or the amount that rent goes up to trigger some kind of rental mediation. If you look at that in 1 year, that's not so much. But if you do look at that, if that were to happen year after year over a 4 or 5 year period, yes, that could be excessive. What I would like to consider, and I'll throw it out, is some kind of, yes, you can do 7% for a year or two, but if you start hitting a higher percentage, if that raises it up too quickly over maybe a 3-year process, then there's some kind of thing. At the next point, you would trigger it off. Now that's sort of complicated, and I'm not really stating that in a real concise way, but over a period of time, a 7% a year would be a lot for many tenants to handle. I've been involved in commercial rental property for a while, and that CPI idea is something that we often do in that. But I also understand that tenant or residential property is often more volatile and can reflect market situation. And then, let's see, one other idea that I'd throw out. I didn't think this was going to be all that concise here, but I do like the idea that tenants have some skin in the game in terms of costs of this thing. We're proposing a $15 per unit charge, which I think for most landlords is not going to be prohibitive. It is one more cost, but when you compare that to your business license costs and every other thing you're going, that's a pretty incremental amount. But I think it would also be something to consider that if a tenant wants to trigger this process, maybe they have to pay $15. That's not a lot. It's not too much for, I think, most of the tenants in town, and yet it gives them a little skin in the game, and you know, it helps. It helps to defer some of the costs, not a lot, but again, I think it makes them a little more. They'd have to think a little bit about when they wanted to trigger this process or under what situation. I have other ideas on pass-through costs. I'd like to see some consideration of costs that landlords can control, say parking or storage, be something that would be considered as part of this, the cost of rent. And yet, I don't think they should be penalized for if they have to pay more on utilities or property taxes go up, or if they say they have a mortgage that the interest rate has changed, then I think those are legitimate costs that could be added on to a rent increase. But again, they should be able to document this if this comes into discussion for mediation. I'm not so sure that I would feel good about a landlord refinancing their building in order to take out a large amount of money to use somewhere else, not on the building, and then charging the tenants for this new increase in their mortgage costs. There's something unfair to my mind about that. But that's getting a little granular, but those are the comments I've written down so far.
Rochelle? Yeah, I'll start with echoing what both Michael Barnes and Pete Moss just said, that this was not intended to be even a conversation tonight about rent control. This isn't a rent control proposal. And that means, I think, that rents are ultimately can go to the fair market value. As painful as that may be for a tenant who is living in a unit at a time when rents are going up dramatically. That's why we took this up in the first place, was not because anybody was coming forward and saying, philosophically, a little town with, we have 15,000 roughly people that we, if you leave out the village, which is not subject to Albany's jurisdiction for any kind of housing regulation. So we're perhaps half the size of any California city that has rent control. Rent control is just not, I think, a realistic option for a city this size. So with regard to rent review, we took this up because there was a crisis, which I'm not hearing anybody say that the crisis is still occurring. And I'm hearing a lot of people say, well, the crisis has kind of passed. But the crisis could recur at any time. You can have a quickly rising market. You can also have, outside of the crisis that affects the broad population, you can have the very typical situation where you've had a lovely landlord and they have charged very reasonable rents, and over time the rent has become below market. And then your landlord decides to go out of business or dies or something, they sell it, and a new landlord comes in and hits you with fair market value rent, and it's essentially an eviction. You get, a huge increase that you cannot pay. And what a rent review process and a number for triggering rent review does is it spreads that process out over time so that it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time. So I think that that's the point of the 7%, is not that how much is reasonable for rents to rise over time. We're saying that rents can rise to the fair market value, but we're saying that's the ceiling of which it's really reasonable to raise in any one given year. It shouldn't be, people should not be hit with 50% rent increases. We've heard horror story after horror story about that. So I lean to supporting the staff proposal. A few little tweaks. I think it is important that we have rent review because we need to protect people from those terrible situations. The main tweak that I wanted to ask the staff about is the issue of habitability. And we've had a few people get up and say, the rent's going up, but my place is not being maintained. And I don't know if the city has a mechanism to assist people. I assume that the Eden, the program that we participate in, the mediation program, could help people with that.
Eco housing?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They do provide assistance to tenants and landlords in those circumstances. Mm-hmm.
Good. If there is, I would like us to think between this reading and the next, whether there is anything that we should think about in connection with rent review, because part of the rent review, it seems to me, is not only what you're paying, but what you're getting in return. If your place is not being maintained, in effect, you're paying more for less than you bargained for. And so I think that we should look at if there is anything that we can do through this ordinance to help support people who are being mistreated in that manner. Well, I mean, there's so many little details. I don't want to go into each element on the chart or anything. I'll try to write some of that, my thoughts up. Okay. But that's my main thing that I'd like considered here.
Can I just say a few more things that I forgot, really? 30 seconds. Margie, I haven't forgotten your comments, and I will pass them on for consideration in round 2. There are state laws that govern apartment health standards and maintenance standards, are there not?
There are. I mean, the city does provide support to tenants through eco housing by providing funding for advice and advocacy on behalf of tenants. We don't do that directly through city staff, but there are state laws that those organizations invoke, such as a warranty of habitability, which is basically a legal requirement that units that are being rented out are actually habitable. So there are state laws that provide tenant protections, and those are kind of landlord-tenant issues that might be outside the scope of this ordinance, but it might be possible to add in the list of factors that the rent review officer considers when recommending what a fair increase is, the condition of the unit.
Yeah.
Well, I think along that line, if nothing else happens, it at least starts a dialogue so the tenant feels like there's a resource there. They have somebody they can talk to about this kind of situation. So I think that is perhaps just kind of a side benefit that perhaps we hadn't even thought about. So I guess I'm going to be the one that goes sort of line by line, but I don't have a whole lot of lines.
Okay.
And the first thing that I do want to say is just to thank all of you for coming and for participating and participating so graciously tonight. It's been really a good discussion, and I appreciate that. Some of these, we got some emails today. Some of my comments come from those emails that I thought were good points, and I think we should look at. And I think it was mentioned tonight on the findings. You know, when I read that, I had a little flinch about governmental interest, and that seemed a little scary. How about something like, and Nicole, I could email all this to you. The city has interest in continuing and increasing certainty, stability, and fairness within the residential market. I think that's a little softer. I think that might work. For base rent, I agree with Pete. I think, you know, utilities should not be, you know, the landlord doesn't have any control over the utilities. It's what it is. But I think things like storage and parking and maybe the gardening service and all of those things, I think those should be included in with the base rent. The notice of availability, I like getting that when the person moves in, that they're given something that explains about the rent review program. And then again, if the rent is raised. So they have 2 opportunities to see that. Somebody mentioned about the conditions for good cause, including things like jury duty, non-refundable travel fees. I don't know how many more detailed things we want to put in, but we might want to think about the best way to express that. Factors considered during mediation. I think that in the chart, the property owners had a little concern about financial information sort of being given out to tenants, and the same conversely, I believe. It seems like that information could go to the mediator and not sort of everyone in the process, and I don't know, but we might think about that. You know, I do have a little angst about the 7%. I think it's high. You know, I'm looking at the CPI. I can also understand that the cost of repairs and labor and all those things are higher than the CPI, so I'm wondering if a 5% trigger would be a good compromise. I think that's something we might want to think about. That would be us. I like Brian Martin's idea about the email. I think we could add that phrase in there. And as far as the fee, I do think it's important for everybody to have some skin in the game. Certainly the city's going to have the biggest piece, and that's fine. I think $15, the tenant and the landlord could both pay that. I don't think that's outrageous. You know, just sort of some general thoughts as far as, you know, the housing crisis is somewhat let up, I think, but it'll come back at some point. We don't know when, but it will. And I don't want to be behind the curve again, so when people are coming, we're going, oh, we should probably start thinking about this. We need to think about it now so that we have something in place. You know, we are trying to find a balance, and it's difficult to find the perfect balance. And I think it's important to remember that it's an ordinance. We can change it. We don't want to be changing it every month, but it doesn't mean we're going to have it forever. We can change it. We can make adjustments to it. And I don't want the perfect to ruin the good. And sometimes I think we get kind of caught up in making the perfect decision. And I think we can get something that's really good, and that's what we need right now. So with all of that, I'm not sure what the next step is. Do you want?
So we have the suggested changes. One thing that I want to be clear on is, as each council member are providing suggested changes, that there is general concurrence on those changes, and one certainly of substance is the trigger.
Right.
So I'd like some direction from the council at large on what % you'd like to see in the second reading.
Okay, before we do that one, let's do the little ones first, so we get those, maybe they're easier. Are there any thoughts about either what any of us have said that maybe you do or don't support on the smaller pieces?
Yeah, I think it's one of the smaller pieces, but that whole skin in the game thing, I think there's been a couple suggestions. One, that tenants pay the same as landlords do on a yearly basis. I think I would leave it at if a tenant wants to initiate the process of mediation, they have a one-time cost that they put forward, and that could be 15, that could be 25, it could be more. I'm not sure what that number is, but not so much that it would discourage anybody from doing it, but enough to make somebody realize, well, I'm doing this, I'm committing to it, and I'm going to participate in the process.
Like a copay at Kaiser.
Yeah, like a copay.
Copay, okay.
Exactly.
Your thoughts?
On the factors to be considered in evaluating the fairness of the rent, in addition to the condition of the unit, I thought that David Hertzer made a point that made some sense about the fair market value and history. If the particular landlord has, if it's the same landlord that you've had for years and they've been charging you below market rent for years, I don't think we want, we'd like the rental review to be able to take into consideration that that you've been, that the rent, it has been below market. So I think that the fair market value as part of as one of the factors that the rent review should consider is a reasonable thing to request.
I thought about it at the time when I first heard it. It's an interesting concept, and it's something we do when you buy or sell a house. You have an appraiser come in and appraise the house, but appraising apartments could be a pretty sticky issue. And so although I think it would be good information, I'm a little concerned whether or not the city has the resources to do a good job of trying to calculate fair market rates. If you just go and look on Craigslist, that's fine. Another issue I think I need to get on the table now is about due process and notification. From the landlord side, there was a letter about, what if you tell me to show up at a meeting, but I've already made vacation plans and the tickets aren't refundable? And there's concerns like that. On the tenant side, there's also, here's a hypothetical. Teachers tend to be renters often because if they don't have kids, they have flexible lives. And what if they go away in the summer for 2 months? And while they're away in Europe, they get a letter about some process and they're not there to get it. That goes for landlords too. When you're involved in a really serious lawsuit, you have to get a file server who actually finds the person and physically presents them with a copy of the lawsuit. We don't need to go down that path, but I think we do need to give thought about what constitutes sufficient notice. Is it an email, a letter? Does the letter have to be responded to? Does there have to be a signature? Whatever.
Yeah, I had one question about this idea of email notification. Is that legal? Can we notify people on any of these processes strictly by email? And
Yeah, if the council views email as an adequate notification, the ordinance can provide that that's sufficient as an alternative to personal delivery or U.S. mail.
Okay. Thank you.
So I want to go back to the factor, the rental history. I think that you and Michael are saying two different things. And maybe I'm just not understanding it, but I'm thinking that you're saying it's kind of, as part of the mediation process, is kind of a discussion about, I've owned this property all these years and I've kept it at market rate, and like that? Is that what you're considering?
Yeah, let me pull up the portion, it's on the chart, as factors considered during mediation. And frequency and amount of prior rent increases is one of the is one of the factors. The landlord's mortgage payments and other costs associated with owning and maintaining the property. You know, I think that I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I don't think that someone having a mortgage, you know, somebody comes in, the situation that I described where the property is sold, long-time reasonable landlord, and a new owner comes in and they have a big mortgage and they jack up the rents to market immediately so that they can make their mortgage. That is something we need people to take into consideration when they're buying property, that they may need to spread out that change over some period of years because of rent review. So I'm not a fan of having the mortgage payments as a factor. I would rather that the factor be any evidence that either party can produce of fair market value. You know, you take one of the situations that was described to us was a family situation, but it could have been an ordinary landlord situation where the person was charging $350 a month because they loved their tenant, literally loved their tenant. But that should be, I think, part of the consideration. That's much more important to me in evaluating the fairness of a rent increase than whether the person has a mortgage on that unit, whether they have been providing below market rate housing over time.
Well, in fact, one of the first people that spoke was the fellow who'd been a long-term landlord who said he taught economics at Stanford, and he said the same thing, that whether or not there's a mortgage is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, so are we sort of all there on that one? So you're saying it should be like...
I'm saying we could drop the mortgage. We should keep other costs, because things like the costs that we impose, we say, you know, you got to fix your sidewalk. Well, that's a cost that is reasonable to think about in looking at rents. But I would say strike the mortgage and replace it with fair market value.
I will say, based on my own personal experience as a homeowner, ideally we'd like landlords to build in generous, you know, amounts of depreciation into their business plan so that when one-time costs come up, they have money socked away to cover them. That's how depreciation is supposed to work. But if you look at my back porch and look how much money I've saved to fix that back porch, you know, I'm not a very good example of doing that myself. So, you know, that's why I think rents can fluctuate sometimes.
Okay, are there any other small pieces we want to look at? Okay, then let's look at the trigger. Like I say, I think 7 really goes up over time, and which is why I thought 5 would be kind of a compromise.
Well, I'll just say, inflation's been pretty low for a while, but if you have a 5% trigger and we encounter a situation like, I don't know, maybe we have a crazy president who starts a trade war and all heck breaks, you know, that couldn't possibly happen. But just in case, if you have 5% inflation, you have a 5% trigger, that means that any real price increase that the landlord wants to propose automatically triggers a rent review. So I think there needs to be some kind of buffer in there. Inflation typically, even when it's low, runs 2 or 3%. So you're looking now at about a 4% real price gap there. And 4% seems reasonable. I don't know. I mean, our working group came up with 7% as a compromise. I'm not sure if anyone wants to
clarify that. They actually did not agree on that. What you see suggested as 7% is what staff has suggested based on the other cities that have a rent review program.
Oh, I'm sorry, I stand corrected. I can certainly live with 7%. If the lower you make that trigger, the more and more, rent reviews we're going to see. And so it's sort of as an issue is where do we want to strike the balance, And it's hard for us to know. I don't know what the experience has been in other cities, but they chose 7% for some reason. Whether Albany is different and we need to have a lower trigger, I don't know.
This is this trigger number, it seems to me, is going to have to be reviewed very frequently because it could be a very high number right now with inflation so low, but it could be a very low number if inflation were to take off. So it seems to me it's something that should probably be revisited annually. And for right now, 7% seems quite high to me.
Well, I wonder if we could consider, essentially inflation is CPI, as I understand it anyway. And so if you had CPI plus 2%, whatever that, or plus 3% or plus 4%, something that ties it both to CPI and allows for some market return.
That's a good idea. Then it doesn't have to be revisited every year.
It doesn't have to be revisited.
Yeah.
We have this formula. So if CPI all of a sudden goes haywire, then the rents would be going up conceivably. But if CPI stays low, then there's presumably not as much of a reason to raise rents. So
Does that create any Costa-Hawkins issues to tie it to the CPI?
No, I don't think it does, but it does kind of create a issue of making sure that people who are subject to that requirement to provide notice of rent increase over a certain threshold know what the threshold is.
Well,
Yeah,
you
it's
can
messy.
get the CPI by going online and on a government website, and that
Yeah, it'd require the landlords to go figure it out, yeah.
Also,
Yeah,
that's retrospective CPI. Nobody knows what the inflation rate is now. They only, that data is old. It lags by several months.
One alternative for consideration would be that the council provide in the ordinance that the threshold or trigger would be set by resolution of the city council, so it'd be easier to review that periodically and revise it as necessary based on what's happening with inflation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
But we have to remember, this trigger amount doesn't say anything about ultimately how much the rent increase the landlords can charge. The landlords still are free to, once they've been through the mediation process, to raise the rent as much as they like, because we're not doing rent control, we're just asking there to be a rent review. So you got to just keep in perspective what the 7% means.
Okay, well, I think what I'd like is to have a motion on this, and then just the rest of it could be just giving you direction. So I'll make a motion that we set the trigger at 5%.
What about,
Set it by, and then change it by resolution as needed. Is that seems,
Or annually, make it an annual
I think
review.
it'd have to at least be annually. Yeah.
okay.
If that's the direction you go, then what I'd suggest is at second reading, staff prepare a resolution setting it at 5%. So that, and then you could annually amend that resolution as necessary without having to go through the ordinance amendment process.
Okay.
I'll second that.
so we still need a vote tonight. Are we now voting on Craig's suggestion?
It's at 5% with the council resolution annually. Does that work? Okay, and you've,
To be included in the second reading.
Right.
so and you're still seconding that?
And I'm seconding.
Okay.
Do you need to repeat it? Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Councilmember Pilch? I'm sorry.
Excused?
Vice Mayor Nason?
Yes.
Mayor McQuaid?
Yes, and that motion carries. And you have enough direction for the other changes that we put in there? And we can also email them to you? And then if as you're so good at, a red line version would be really great. Well, thank you again.
You still need to vote on the introduction of the ordinance.
Oh. I'm sorry, you asked.
Under detail.
Well, no, I was doing the direction piece. Okay, can I get a motion? I don't have it even written down. Hang on, sorry.
An iPad race here.
Okay, can I get a motion for the staff recommendation to introduce the ordinance 2018-02, adding Chapter 5-25 Rent Review to Chapter 5 of the City of Albany Municipal Code, first reading? Is that good? That was a motion.
Second. I second.
Councilmember,
Wait, we don't have a second yet.
I'll
second.
second to.
I'm sorry, I
Follow
didn't
the
I didn't hear you,
process,
Michael.
yeah.
It's after 10.
Councilmember Barnes?
Yes.
Councilmember Moss?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Nason?
Yes.
Mayor McQuaid?
Yes, and the motion carries. Okay, there's no unfinished business, no new business. Any future agenda items anybody wants? Okay, the next council meeting will be on Monday, April 16th. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you all again.